everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Do Good to Lead Well podcast series. I'm your host, Craig Dowden, and once again, it's a pleasure to have you join us today for another engaging conversation. And before we start, I always love to highlight and acknowledge everyone who's joined us today, people who have been part of these live conversations since their inception. A warm welcome back. Always awesome to have you. You ask great questions of the guests. And for those of you who are new to the Do Good to Lead Well universe, and also a very warm welcome. We are approaching our 100th episode, which will be launched next week. And because of your ongoing support, your interest, your comments, your feedback, your social shares, we are ranked in the top 0.5% of podcasts globally. And so thank you very, very much. Your ongoing support means so much, and it enables us to talk about how we can do good, lead well, build positive teams, positive organizations, and positive communities. And the primary reason why this podcast has been where it is because of the extraordinary guests. And once I was connected with Kim Scott, I was so excited to get this in the calendar and have this conversation, which, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, it's so timely. It's so important. Like, we could probably speak for hours about all of the different ideas that are shared. And so Kim Scott is the best-selling author of Radical Respect, How to Work Together Better, and Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity, and the co-founder of the company Radical Candor. Kim was a CEO coach at Dropbox, Qualtrics, Twitter, and other tech companies. She was a member of the faculty at Apple University, and before that led AdSense, YouTube, and DoubleClick teams at Google. Prior to that, Kim managed a pediatric clinic in Kosovo and started a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. She co-hosts the podcasts Radical Candor and Radical Respect and lives with her family in Silicon Valley. As you can see behind me, I have all of her books, just absolutely powerful reads, all of them. Clients that I work with, coaching clients, speaking clients, routinely reference the content, the ideas, the principles, the frameworks, and how transformative they are, and how they've really influenced how they lead on a day-to-day basis in their personal and professional lives. And this is just the highest level. I could have spent many more minutes going through this. So Kim, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. It is really an honor to be here with you today, and I've been looking forward to our conversation.
Well, me as well, and thank you. Kim has kindly agreed to take questions from the live audience. So there's a lot of us here today, so please jump in early. I'm monitoring the chat room, and so we can ask him any questions that you wish. And so, as I mentioned, books behind me, I would love to get your take in terms of what was your inspiration for writing Radical Respect and how it builds on some of the ideas in Radical Candor and what your goal was in sharing this with the world.
So if you write a book about feedback, which Radical Candor very much was, you're bound to get a lot of it. And indeed I did. Hands down, the best feedback that I got about Radical Candor came from a colleague of mine when I was giving a Radical Candor talk at her tech company in San Francisco. And I was really excited to do this talk at her company. She'd been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade. She's a person I like and respect enormously, so I was thrilled to do this. And after I finished giving the talk, she pulled me aside and she said, Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of innovative culture that I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me than it is for you to roll it out. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, people would call her an angry Black woman. And I knew this was true as soon as she said it. And I also knew how unfair it was, because she's one of the most even-keeled, cheerful people I've ever worked with. And as soon as she said that to me, I had 4 realizations at the same time, and these became sort of the 4 chapters that organized radical respect. The first thing that I realized was that I had not been an upstander. I had failed to intervene on when this happened to her. In fact, I would say I was not just a silent bystander, but an oblivious bystander. I had never even noticed the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting we were ever in together, even though she had what to be pissed off about, as we all do at work. But she wasn't allowed to express her emotions in the way that I was. And I think about that, as I think of the kind of colleague I want to be, I would imagine that I would have intervened in that, but I had failed to do it. Now, the second thing that I realized was that not only had I been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to her at work, I was also in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to me at work. Sometimes I was the target of disrespectful attitudes and behaviors. And I never chose to respond, but I just pretended it wasn't happening. Kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit, but I've been really deeply in denial. And I think I was in denial in that way, in part because I never wanted to think of myself or of her as victims. But even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, did I want to think of myself as the culprit. So the third thing that I realized was that I was most deeply in denial when I was the one who had the disrespectful attitude or behavior that made it harder than it needed to be for my colleagues to get their jobs done. And then the fourth thing that I realized was that as a leader, I imagined that I was creating these BS-free zones that would help everyone do the best work of their lives and enjoy working together. But by pretending that a whole host of disrespectful attitudes and behaviors were not happening, I was unable to prevent them from happening. And therefore it was harder than it needed to be for my team to work together. So that was a big drink of water, but that was what prompted me to sit down and write Radical Respect.
Well, and thank you. And I already got multiple comments coming in about how awesome an answer that is. And a couple of things for me that really stand out, Kim. Number one is your passion for this. As you read the book, it's so engaging, and your passion for the subject matter. I may even add a radical transparency.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
are so open about your challenges as well as your successes. And as a reader, and again, I cannot more strongly recommend going and getting both books, because you are really engaged with those stories that you tell. And in particular, you break them down in such a way that it's almost like we're a co-pilot there with you.
Yeah.
And also you unpack the thinking and the feeling we each experience in those moments. And it's so powerful, because I feel like then it drives that practical application that I know, or I sense was a big, big part
Yeah.
of this book. And so can you, at a high level for everyone listening today, what does radical respect mean?
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, let's double click just on the word respect, because it has 2 very different definitions, and it's important to understand the difference. Oops, I don't know why this happens. Victory, I got balloons. Anyway, 2 very different definitions. One definition of respect, which is not the one that I mean when I'm talking about radical respect, is something you have to earn. So I have to earn your respect for me as a writer by doing good writing. But there's another definition of respect, which is more unconditional. It's the regard that we all owe each other for our shared humanity. And that's the kind of respect. I owe it to you to pay attention and to have regard for your background, your emotions, how you're showing up today, for you as a human being. That kind of regard, that kind of respect doesn't mean I have to agree with you on everything. And it also doesn't mean that I can't hold you accountable if you make a mistake. And it also doesn't mean that you can't hold me accountable when I make mistakes, which I'm bound to do. But it does mean that while we're holding each other accountable and while we're disagreeing with each other, we have to show some respect. And that's really what I mean by respect. Why do I call it radical respect? Because it's rare. Radical respect happens when we are on a team that optimizes for collaboration, not coercion, where we have collaborative hierarchies, not dominance hierarchies, and where we respect and honor everyone's individuality rather than demanding conformity. And it's kind of strange to think, why doesn't this always happen? Because I've literally never met a leader who says, oh, yeah, I want to create a dominance hierarchy. I mean, there are some out there who do that, but they're rare. Fortunately, they're rare. Unfortunately, they're also very loud. And then there's also I've never met anyone who said, I want to work or I want to create a sort of dystopic, everybody's marching in lockstep, 1984 environment that demands that we all conform, that we're all the same. So why is radical respect so rare? And that's really the question I tried to answer in the book.
Well, and I love that and appreciate how you distinguish between what respect means, the operating definition, and I really appreciate how you dig into and dive into this is the positive regard we have for everyone. Being human
Yeah,
beings, we respect one another. We have
yeah,
that appreciation. Now we can vehemently disagree on our
yes,
perspectives, ideas, and
yeah,
opinions, yet the respect we hold for another that is sacred. That is
yes,
sacrosanct. And I love
yes.
that as a foundation. There are questions coming through, so I'll ask one more of my questions because I think it's such right away in the opening pages is just an idea that I think is so profoundly powerful and helpful for all of us to start thinking about this in a different way. You differentiate bias, prejudice, and bully.
Yeah,
And a
yeah.
lot of times people will kind of mash them together or talk about. Can you walk us through those three terms and how you frame them? Because throughout the book, it's just such a powerful reference point for us to think about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So I think that bias, prejudice, and bullying are are three things that get in the way of radical. I mean, there's a million things, but I'm going to boil it down to those three. And I think one of the problems with bias, prejudice, and bullying is that we often conflate them. And then the problem feels monolithic and insoluble. And so if you're facing a hard problem, what do? You break it down into its component parts and you take it bird by bird, as Anne Lamott says. And so I'm going to offer some super simple definitions of bias, prejudice, and bullying so that we can begin to distinguish them and figure out what to do when we notice these things happening. Bias, I'm going to define as not meaning it. What I really mean by bias is unconscious bias. And we're, as human beings, we're pattern makers. And sometimes we make good patterns and sometimes we make bad patterns. And so unconscious bias, I'm talking about a bad pattern. Prejudice, on the other hand, is meaning it. So if bias is not meaning it, prejudice is meaning it. Prejudice is a very consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype. And prejudice tends to be a little bit harder to deal with than bias, and we have a more emotional response when we notice it. And last but not least, there's bullying. Bullying is not about a belief, conscious or unconscious. Bullying is just being mean. So bias not meaning it, prejudice meaning it, bullying being mean. And very often how many people on this call have been in a meeting recently where something happened that kind of made you cringe, but you didn't know what to say, you know? So here's some thoughts on what to say when you don't know what to say, when you notice something and you're not even sure. First of all, just having a simple framework can help you engage your executive function and move out of your lizard brain, which is often our response to bias, prejudice, and bullying. And so if you think it's bias, I recommend responding with an I statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. It sort of holds up a mirror. Whereas if you think it's prejudice, I recommend responding with an it statement, because if it's prejudice, holding up a mirror is not going to work. The other person is going to grin in the mirror. They're going to like what they see, you know? And so an it statement sort of draws a line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose that belief on you or on anyone else. And an it statement can appeal to a law, it can appeal to a company policy, or it can appeal to common sense. It is illegal to, it is an HR violation to, or it is ridiculous to, blah, 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 blah. Uh, but if it is bullying, you don't want an it statement, because if you show someone who's in bullying mode where a boundary is, you can be sure they're going to try to kick past it. It doesn't do much good. And you also don't want an I statement if it's bullying, because an I statement sort of brings the person in close to you. And if it's bullying, you want to push them away from you, actually. My daughter taught me this when she was in 3rd grade. She was getting bullied on the playground, and I was encouraging her, making a mistake that a lot of parents make. Oh, tell this child, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. My daughter was banged her fist on the table, and she said, Mom, they're trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? That's a really good point. So in the case of bullying, you want a you statement. You can't talk to me like that, or what's going on for you here? Even a you non sequitur. Where'd you get that shirt? The point of the you statement or question or non sequitur is that you're not in a submissive role. You're not taking whatever it is they dished out. You are in an active role. You're doing the asking.
And thank you. And again, so many, I wouldn't be able to read all the comments. Awesome, very insightful, love the framework, very helpful with tactical tips and strategies. Thank you, Kim, amazing insights. So
I love hearing that. Thank you.
oh, it's phenomenal. And this is why I was so excited about our conversation, because you touched on it. We often conflate it, and then we use these terms interchangeably. And what I love, what you just shared, taking a moment and thinking about, okay, what is happening? What do I feel is happening? And then adjusting the strategies. Because I think what's also really interesting, sometimes, often people will use different approaches, as you just expertly laid out for us. And then they're using it in the, let's quote unquote, wrong or least optimal situation. And then it's almost, oh, well, I can't do anything. And I think one of the things I love is you're going, okay, let's be mindful around this, get out of the lizard brain, be more strategic and thoughtful. So I'm going to transition to audience questions, because
amazing
is coming up. Yeah, this is great. And this is why I love doing it live, because I have a fabulous opening question from Leanne, who said, having written both books, Kim, do you think that radical respect is a requirement for radical candor?
Yeah, in many ways, radical respect is kind of the prequel to radical candor. So radical candor is about caring personally and challenging directly at the same time. And you're not going to care about someone or challenge them if you don't respect them, if you don't have that sort of unconditional regard for them as a human being. Having said that, when people say, I want to roll these things out at my company, should I start with radical candor or radical respect? I will acknowledge that radical candor is easier. It's radical respect is it's a harder book and a harder topic to talk about. And so I think you should feel free to start in it. The important thing is to start.
I love that. And again, thank you. Very helpful, very insightful. And I've got another question. They're just piling in. So this is great. Also have a question from Christina, who says, I love the idea of radical candor and radical respect. Yet I wonder about the consistency of its application, knowing how tired we and our executive teams are sometimes, weeks, months, seasons. Is it okay to pick your battles when it comes to radical candor and respect? And do you have any suggestions for how to decide when to engage and when not to engage?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that one of the things that I recommend in radical candor actually was advice that was given at a friend of mine's wedding by her godfather. And her godfather said, leave 3 unimportant things unsaid every day. So neither radical candor nor radical respect are about nitpicking. If it's not important, you don't need to say it. But I think that more often than not, when, at least for me, and I'd love to hear from you all what your experience is, but when I tell myself, oh, I'm going to wait for a better moment, what I'm really saying is I'm never going to have this conversation. And so I think it's really important to recognize that we can build up feedback debt in our relationships.
Mm.
And we can allow this sort of elephant in the room to take over the room if we don't take steps to get it out. So one of the things I did in Radical Respect, if we go back to that story about the feedback I got and the 4 realizations I had, it was based on 4 different roles that all of us play at different moments. Sometimes we are the leader in the room. And when we're the leader in the room, I think we have an obligation to try to prevent bias, prejudice, and bullying from destroying our team's ability to collaborate. And of course, bias, prejudice, and bullying are inevitable. So congratulations, leaders. Your job is to prevent the inevitable. That's why you get paid the big bucks. But you at the very least want to recognize that it happened so that you can prevent it from happening again. So you've got the most responsibility when you're the leader. As an upstander, you have an obligation to intervene in some way. You don't necessarily have to stand up and intervene directly in the moment, but at the very least, you want to check in with the person who was harmed later and see what you can do to support them. So you have more obligation. If you are the person who was harmed, if you're the target of the disrespectful attitude or behavior, then you get to choose a response. But I think it's really important to make that choice a proactive choice. I will admit that for too much of my career, I just ignored this stuff that was happening to me and pretended it wasn't happening. I sort of defaulted to silence. And when I found over time that when I defaulted to silence, I was losing a sense of my own agency. And that's one thing none of us can afford. And so I think it's important to do, it's very obvious that the fear of retribution is very visceral. And so the risks of speaking up when you're the person, the target of the bias, prejudice, or bullying, the risks are often very, you feel them in your gut and you know them immediately in your head. But taking an extra beat to sort of think about what's the cost of remaining silent. Very often when we think about the ROI of speaking up, then we understand why Audre Lorde said your silence will not protect you, because it won't. And last but not least, when we're the person who caused harm and we're the person who had the disrespectful attitude or behavior, I tried to do what I call ACK. That's my acronym. It's 5 A's and a C. The first thing is to be aware. I don't demand that someone else educate me. I try to realize that ignorance is no excuse. I try to be aware of what I did wrong. I try to acknowledge publicly what I did wrong rather than trying to hide it. I try to accept the consequences. Often we go into denial mode because we're afraid we're going to get into trouble, but the cover up is always worse than the crime. So I try to accept whatever consequences there may be for what I did wrong. And I try even to make amends, to go to do more than is demanded by the consequences. And only after I've done those 4 things can I apologize for what I did wrong. If I leap too quickly to apology, I wind up dismissing. I wind up saying, oh, I'm sorry you feel that way, which is not an apology, right? And then last but not least, the C and ACK is to change. I try to change my behavior. And I have to be I have to extend some grace to myself. I have to be patient with myself, but also persistent, because very often, especially in the case of bias, these are deeply ingrained habits of speech and words that we've been using since we learned to speak that we realize we shouldn't use anymore, but we've got to, it's just because we realize it doesn't mean that we can change a bad habit immediately.
No, I love so much in there. I've got comments. I'm going to continue to. This is a master class being taught. Thank you, Kim. So much insight. Love the passion for the content. Really valuable takeaways. Thank you. And I really, once again, I love the frameworks that you introduce. And one of the points, I'm so glad you referenced this, Kim, in your answer. It spoke to me so strongly about the importance of speaking our truth, if you will, for our own sense of agency. And the other point that you added, which I thought was just genius and something that gets in our own way of doing this, letting go of an expectation that the other person is going to change as a consequence.
Yeah.
I'm stating this for me because this is right and this is important to stand. They can still do it. And that agency. And I thought that was such a powerful way to frame that. Can you unpack that a little more for us in terms of how that really assists us in continuing to be upstanders in day to day?
Yeah, I mean, it's so frustrating when you notice something that's wrong, that's happening, and you have the courage to speak out and nothing changes. Uh, and it's tempting to feel like, there was no point in speaking out. I'm screaming into the void, but you're not. You never know who's listening. You never know what the impact is down the road. And so I think it's really important to think about the benefits. Now, I don't want to tell people you have to speak out every single time, especially if the problem is directed at you. But if you're the upstander and you don't say anything, how many times, I would love to hear from folks, how many times have you noticed something happen? Maybe you notice somebody getting bullied, or you notice somebody saying something biased, or you notice kind of a prejudice attitude, and you didn't say anything. And it wasn't because you felt like maybe it wasn't your place. It wasn't directed towards you. You weren't sure if you should. And then it woke you up at 3 a.m. And you're like, gosh, why didn't I say something? Like, there is, when you are a silent bystander in the face of something that you know to be wrong, you suffer a moral injury. And it's important to be aware of that. So not only do you want to speak up for the sake of the team and helping the team work better together, for the sake of your results, for the sake of this person who was harmed, but there's also some self-interest in that, because if you don't speak up, you suffer a moral injury. I think also when it's directed at you and you feel like, I just have to accept this, you begin to feel like helpless. And that is not going to help you succeed in your life or in your career. And so figuring out, like, maybe I've made a very conscious decision that the ROI of speaking up is not worth it. But then I've picked my battles. Whereas if you default to silence, you're allowing someone else to pick your battles for you. And so I think it's really important, if you're the person who's harmed, to pick your battles. But again, I don't like it when people say, oh, you have to be courageous, because that implies that you're cowardly if you're picking your battles, and you're not. You're making a decision that is a positive ROI decision for you.
Absolutely. And I love that. Again, it's taking, as we were talking about earlier as well, kind of ideas that are conflated or very black and white in their application. Well,
Yeah.
you have to be courageous. And what I love is that you say, regardless of what situation you're in, make it a conscious choice, be intentional.
Yes.
And align it with and do a quick kind of assessment of, so what is the ROI? And
Yeah.
now what you're doing is leaning in for you. And that's the
Yes.
ultimate personal choice.
Yeah.
And it's a radical form of respect for yourself.
Yes. Yes.
So I love that idea. More questions. It's just coming in. So Carolyn asks, in a fast-paced environment where efficiency and quick decision making are critical, how can leaders balance the need for radical candor, which often requires thoughtful and often time-consuming feedback, with the demands of operational efficiency without compromising on either?
Yeah. I mean, my experience is that the best radical candor I've ever received in my whole career has always happened in these impromptu 2-minute conversations in between meetings. So it doesn't have to take a long time. In the book, I tell the story about my boss after a meeting saying, walk back to my office with me, and telling me, I thought the meeting was triumphant and that I was this genius. And my boss said I sounded stupid because I had said so many times. And she didn't start there. I brushed her off a couple of times, and she never would have used. Sometimes people say, oh, it was mean of her to do that. but it was actually the kindest thing she could have done for me at that moment in my career. Because if she hadn't used just those words with me, and by the way, she never would have used them with other people on her team who are better listeners than I was, but if she didn't use just those words with me, I never would have gone to visit the speech coach.
Mm.
So that to me is an example of operational efficiency. It didn't take her any extra time. It took some emotional energy, but I was walking to her next meeting with her. She had to walk there anyway. And it had a huge impact on my career and on my ability to be successful and to generate the kind of results for the team that I needed to put up for her to be successful, for me to be successful, for all of us to be successful. And that is really important. I mean, it's fast. Radical Candor is fast, 2-minute impromptu conversations. It's free. It didn't cost any extra money for her to do that. But it does take enormous emotional discipline. And that is often actually what we are lacking as leaders. And that's in part because we allow ourselves to be exhausted. That's why it's so important to take care of yourself and to remain centered so that you do have that extra energy to have that impromptu 2-minute conversation. Because if you don't, then what happens is you get feedback debt, and the problem piles up, piles up, piles up. It gets bigger, and it gets worse. So it's bad for results. It also is bad for your relationship, because if you don't tell someone about something they're doing wrong, they're going to do it again and again, and you're going to be more and more irritated with them. And so by the time you finally do say the thing, the results are terrible, and you probably don't say it in the kindest, most radically candid. You're probably going to be obnoxiously aggressive.
Well, this is great, and again, lots of comments coming through thanking you for the answer. And Karen earlier on said, "I love the idea of feedback debt. I've
Yes.
never heard of it, and it makes so much sense. I'm guilty of it in all caps with exclamation."
Yes, that's
And
why I
it's
wrote the book.
yes, absolutely. And what I love as well, it kind of reminds me of like medical, right? When in medical intervention, hey, if you have an early symptom,
Yeah.
get at it early before it gets bigger and bigger and
Yeah.
more complex trying to deal with this. It's just again so powerfully important to remind ourselves. So I've another question coming through from Francis, who says, how can we effectively implement radical candor in a company where open and direct communication is currently a challenge and feedback is often given through back channels? What specific steps would you recommend to foster a culture of direct and honest communication? And how do we overcome resistance from employees who are either used to indirect feedback methods or even very little feedback to start with?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things you can do. One is if you can explain what radical candor means by telling stories from your career. When is that? What's your story? When's that time when someone told you something that maybe stung a little bit at the time, but stood you in good stead for the next 5-10 years? And explain to them what that's what radical candor means, and that's the benefit. And also think about your ruinous empathy story. When is that time when you didn't say the thing to the person, just trying to be nice, and the net result was really bad for that person, for your relationship with that person, and for the results on your team? And if you can begin illuminating radical candor with your stories and asking your team for their stories, like your brains will later literally get on the same wavelength. So that's just sort of creating a shared vocabulary for radical candor can be very helpful. And then the other thing that I think is really important to do in a culture where there's maybe some manipulative insincerity, where people are talking badly about each other behind each other's backs, which there are a lot of, that happens everywhere. I mean, it's not like there's some, but you want to create a norm of clean escalation. You want to make sure that you practice this and that you enforce this when people come to you. That if someone comes to you and is talking about someone else on the team who's not in the room, that's the one time when listening is not a good idea, where listening is like just stirs the political pot. So if Joe comes to you talking about Jane and Jane is not in the room, you say to Joe, have you spoken with Jane about this? And
Mm,
Joe will say, either I've tried and it's impossible, at which point you say, all right, the three of us are going to get together.
mm,
Or no, I haven't. Would you go talk to Jane? And if you can't work it out, come to me together. And, especially as a leader, but no matter who you are, triangulation, it just doesn't work. You're not a shuttle diplomat. Like in all these situations, you're more like a relationship counselor than you are a shuttle diplomat. So you want to make sure that you're. I mean, we learned in middle school, don't talk badly about people behind their backs. Like,
mm.
let's remember that rule that we learned when we were much younger and apply it at work. I mean, there are exceptions, of course. If somebody comes to you saying they've been sexually harassed, don't make them go talk to their harasser. But in the usual sorts of conflicts that happen at work, make sure people are talking together. And especially if you're the leader of the team, you need to offer your conflict resolution services. You need to bring them in together and help find a reasonable way forward. It may be your least favorite part of your job, conflict resolution, but it is part of the job.
Well, and thank you. And so many great takeaways from this. And again, lots of comments coming through. One of the points you just made, it's so funny. So in my coaching work, and then if I'm working with different executives, I love the reference to counseling because sometimes good naturedly
Yeah.
they'll say, hey, this kind of feels like couples counselors.
Yes.
And that's a great, I love that insight that you're bringing, Kim, on this. And I've got a comment on thank you for highlighting the ruinous empathy story. That I am so guilty of that, had not considered that before, and you've given me food for thought to reflect on afterwards. So thank you so much. I love that comment. And I think it's so valuable because again, we can miss those counterbalances. Oh, I'm empathetic. That's always fantastic.
Yeah.
And it's more thoughtful in its application. So I think this is really great. Another question coming in from Lisa saying, what metrics or indicators would you recommend for measuring the impact of radical candor or radical respect on team performance and company culture?
So this is a strange answer coming out of Silicon Valley, but I wrote a book called The Measurement Problem.
Mm,
And basically, it's about how very often we're very good at rewarding what we can measure and very bad at rewarding what we value. And so I view radical candor and radical respect as really these are leading indicators, not lagging indicators. So you can measure results, but the score takes care of itself. The results are a lagging indicator. And so what are the things that lead up to results? And I think radical respect, there are some things you can do to measure what matters. You can begin to quantify bias at every stage of the employee life cycle in order to prevent unconscious bias from becoming discrimination, which it does all too often. So you can measure that. So in other words, what I mean is you can take a look at who are you inviting in to interview, and is there a group that's underrepresented, and then you understand why. Who are you hiring? Is there a group that's underrepresented? Take a look at your interview process and try to identify biases that may be skewing your hiring process. You can also take a look at who you're promoting. And is there underrepresentation or overrepresentation in who you're promoting? And does bias impact the process by which you decide who to promote? I'll give you an example. I was working with a CEO who noticed that he never was promoting any women, so he didn't have any women on his team. There were plenty of women at the company, but none of his direct reports were women. And so he invited me to sit in a promotion meeting, and he asked me, just notice, tell me what I'm not noticing. And that's, by the way, really important thing to do is to bring someone in who who may have a different perspective than you do. And there were two people up for promotion, a man and a woman, and they both had teams that were very committed to them. They had both achieved exceptional results, and they were talking about both these people and who should get promoted. And they referred to the man as a great leader, and then they referred to the woman as a real mother hen. I'm like, all right, back the train up.
Right.
I think we found something. And first they were a little, oh, Kim, we didn't really mean it. And of course they didn't mean it, but words matter. And
Yeah.
unconscious bias was, I was like, who are you going to promote? The great leader or the mother hen, and so I think it's really important to make sure that you are quantifying the things you can quantify. But I also think that it's important to recognize that probably the best indicator that things are going well is as Jim Morgan, who is the CEO of Applied Materials, said, no news is bad news. That means people aren't telling you what's going on. Good news is no news because, of course, people, and bad news is good news. And so once you get to the point that you are glad when people are disrupting bias in your meetings, that you're glad when people are criticizing you, and that you're glad when you're uncovering problems because you know you can solve them, that's when you know. But I don't know how to measure that, to tell you the truth. So I think we want to make sure that we're not getting, that we are measuring what we can measure, but also recognizing there are some things that are very valuable and very important that are really difficult to measure. I would say in the case of radical candor, I know that I'm putting it into practice when I walk away from a conversation and I feel gross, kind of the way I do if I walk out of the house without brushing my teeth. I turn around, I go back in, I brush my teeth. I turn around and I go back to the person. I'm like, I didn't say this thing, but I don't know how to measure that.
I love it. And again, so many great comments coming through, and time is flying by. I can't believe we're, approaching the 15-minute remaining mark almost. So again, so great. Here's a question from Steve, and it's been asked in a bunch of different ways from other people. There seems to be a lot of fear, like a lot of
Yes.
anxiety and anger and frustration. And when it comes to issues relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion, like sexism and racism, I want to engage sometimes. I'm afraid to engage. I don't know how. And so it's easier to avoid. How can we, as leaders and organizations, get better at doing this?
Yeah. Fear, when there is an elephant in the room that no one will talk about, fear gets worse. Like fear of the unknown is intense. And so I think that when I sat down to write Radical Respect, and when I started talking about it, I want to acknowledge, like, I felt fear as well. Like if somebody tells me that I've said or done something biased, I feel ashamed. And shame and fear are often very similar. Like I can tell you where I feel it in my body. I feel a tingling in the backs of my knees. It's the same feeling that I get if my children walk too close to the edge of a precipice. It's like a real, almost a panic sensation. And we often have this response to conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, about racism, about sexism, about homophobia, about in any of these topics. There's about anti-Semitism, about Islamophobia, and we often have this sort of fear response. And the thing that I have found helpful is, first of all, to take a deep breath and to acknowledge I'm going to make some mistakes, and to extend grace to myself for making mistakes, to try to approach this topic with what Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset. Not a fixed mindset. A growth mindset says, if I make a mistake in math, it does not mean I'm bad in math. That's a fixed mindset. A growth mindset says, oh, I've made a mistake. What can I learn from this so I can get better? And I think the more we can approach these topics by extending grace to ourselves and to others, knowing we're going to make mistakes and knowing that we can recover from these mistakes, and that the only way we're going to learn and do better and get the elephant out of the room is by approaching these things and talking about them explicitly. I think for so long we said, oh, we can't talk about race, religion, or politics at work, and that did not work. that that refusal to, we have to be able to engage with each other in a way that shows our colleagues that we respect them, and that we're not so afraid of these topics. I will say that I started a company with someone who I disagree with on every hot button political topic you can mention. But we did not have to agree about gun control in order to build great software together. And and so I think it's really important to remember that.
I love that. Well, and thank you. And again, lots of comments coming in, and I really appreciate, Kim, how you challenge us and also correctly point out, hey, we're going to make some mistakes. We're not going to do this.
We're not perfect. None of us are perfect.
And I love how you talk about bringing grace for ourselves and for others in this process. And I'm curious as well, do you feel like if we are more explicit, like just state that openly, hey, I want to have these conversations. I recognize I'm going to misstep. Let me know. I don't know quite how to begin yet. Can you engage with me? How do you find, is that an effective strategy for people to help, again, name the elephant in the room while acknowledging their own imperfection?
Yeah, I think inviting people to, especially as leaders, but no matter who you are, inviting people to bust your biases, even hiring. When I was writing Radical Respect, I hired Breeze Harper, who is a critical race theory a PhD, and I said, read this book and tell me what I've got wrong. And so point out language that I'm using that is biased that I may not be aware of. And it was so valuable. And I will acknowledge at first, and I'm ashamed to acknowledge this a little bit, but I think it's important because I think many of us, I'm not alone in this mistake that I made. And she gave me, there were about 7 words that I tended to use frequently in the book that she said were problematic for one reason or another. And one was, I tended to say blind when what I meant is that I hadn't noticed. So which was ableist language. And my first response to that was, there's no word safe in English. Like, I had a defensive response. And I think we often have a defense, because like this is such a blah. But once I got over, like, engage your brain, I said, okay, how many words? There were 7 words. How many words in the English language? 250,000. So there's plenty of words that are okay. And the second thing that I think can be helpful is try to hook in to someone you care about when you learn these things. So, for example, another person who is helping me to edit Radical Respect is a historian who's blind. And the last thing I wanted to do was to use language that was gonna make it harder for him to engage with the text. And also, like, I'm a writer. I care about words. Words matter, and so I had to engage that. But I cared about my craft, and that made it much easier for me to accept and understand. But here's where the grace comes in. So I knew she was right. I thought I had changed those sloppy site metaphors throughout the book. So now I know it, I understand it, and I think I've changed. But right before I sent the book in to my editor, I did a search. And in a 300-page book, guess how many sloppy site metaphors there still were, even after I got the feedback in 99. Like, it is really difficult to change these deeply ingrained habits of speech. And so we need to keep, we don't, but the point is not to just give up. Oh, it's hard, I'm not going to try. Like, the point is to forgive ourselves for making the mistake again, but to keep trying.
Well, and again, thank you, and comments once again. Really appreciate your transparency, Kim. I've made the same mistakes. It's given me an opportunity to reflect on the words that I use and how they may exclude people
Yeah.
in personal and professional life. That's very valuable. So many fabulous comments. And I love how you approach this as a learning journey. You talked about growth mindset. And I also I really appreciate how you view this as it's like a skill, it's like a
Yeah.
muscle. And so if we don't utilize it, then how do we grow it? How do we get better? And it's going to be lifelong. We all have these things,
Yeah.
accepting them, offering ourselves some grace, and then learning from each interaction. And as you shared, and I love your example where it's, oh, that hurts. And all of us, me included, I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
really? This word? And
Yeah.
then when you step back and take a more thoughtful perspective, so what's my goal here? And I love how you continue to challenge us as readers to think about that. If we're truly trying to establish meaningful, deep connections with people, let's take that moment to engage our brain, as you say. And one other, we're nearing the end. It's incredible how fast this has gone. This is something I think is so important in the time that we live in as well, because you stress the importance of taking shame out of the game when it comes
Yes.
to these discussions, including the perilous effects of self righteous shaming.
Yes.
That section, I was like, this is, I love how you tackle this head on. So, can you talk to us a little bit about these behaviors and how they really don't serve us, the causes that we are looking to promote or stand for, and the other people who are engaged in this discussion?
Yeah, I think that if we go back to the radical respect framework and we think about it, on the vertical axis is collaboration, not coercion, and on the horizontal axis is honoring individuality. There are times when all of us try to coerce others into respecting each other's individuality, and that's just not going to work. And it happens in all kinds of different ways. But the important thing to realize is that you can't coerce people into honoring each other's individuality. You've got to take a more collaborative approach with people, and going on the attack and saying, you use this word, so you're a terrible person. That's not radical respect. That is not honoring the person. But you can correct the person. You can say, you use this word, it has this impact, please don't use this word anymore. So I'm not saying don't hold people accountable, but sort of treating them like they're a worthless human being because they've they've made a mistake. Even with bullying, it can be very tempting to out-bully a bully. And I talk about this in the book, a time when a person who worked for me came into my office and she had been bullied by someone else and was very upset about it. And I was more senior in the organization than the bully. And I called this guy and I like lit into him. And in a way that was self-righteous shaming, that was unproductive, because he hadn't intended to upset her actually. And so we want to make sure that we are working with people in a way that holds them accountable but still shows that radical respect for them.
Mm. Well, and again, I love that, and that story that you share. Once again, the radical transparency in the book that you exhibit, and talk about, hey, you know, hold my beer. I'm going to out bully this bully.
Yeah.
And once again, and what and conversations that I have, what value does it serve? What happens afterwards? All
Yeah.
these kinds of things. And I think it's so important for us to appreciate and think about and reflect on, what are we trying to do and what impact are we attempting to have here, and be more thoughtful. So this has just been amazing. I can't believe we're at the end of our conversation. So many comments and still questions remaining in the chat. And thank you to everybody for your enthusiasm and for your observations throughout. So as we close today, Kim, is there anything that we didn't touch on, or any final piece of advice that you would have for listeners, aspiring leaders, senior executives around what are some things we can do in our day-to-day lives to really lead with radical respect and radical candor?
I think it's so important that leaders create consequences for bullying, that they create conversational consequences, that they create compensation consequences, and that they create career consequences. You want to make sure that you shut down bullying when it's happening in a meeting where you're present. You want to make sure that your compensation systems check for teamwork, and that you don't give people who bully others bonuses, because if you reward bullying, it's just going to escalate, and that you don't promote people who bully others. There's a moment when the jerks begin to win on too many teams' histories. That's a moment when the culture begins to lose. Instead, you want to give that person some feedback that the way they're behaving is career limiting, and if they can't change their behavior, you have to fire them, even if it feels like it's going to leave a hole on your team. And this is a good note to end on, because it's better to have a hole than an asshole.
Drop the mic on that one, right? Yeah, exactly. No, that's fantastic. And thank you. Again, comments continue to pour in. I have to say, personally, it's just a pleasure and a privilege to speak with you. Again, I will highly encourage everyone who's joining us live, who are going to listen to this on the podcast, to go out and get copies of all of your books, because what I love that they do, and I'm going to re-emphasize this again, is really tackle important subjects, topics, issues that we're all seeing personally and professionally, and really engage us to reflect on this in a thoughtful way so we can shift how we show up in our personal and professional lives. So thank you for all the work that you do, all the passion that you bring to this discussion, all the real life examples and the humanity. It's just been an absolute joy. So any final words before we say goodbye today?
Just thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this conversation, and it did not disappoint. I really enjoyed the engagement from your audience and talking with you. So thank you all so much. And check out Radical Respect and Radical Candor.
Yes, go check out all of those resources. You have newsletter, podcast, the company resources, everything that's available, the books. Be a part of the ongoing conversation, and so that we can make a positive difference. So until next time, everybody, thanks again, Kim. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.